This video will explore the Lento con gran espressione by Frédéric Chopin, known as the C-sharp minor nocturne. The aim is to provide a nuanced perspective on a piece that exemplifies the art of piano playing while employing fewer notes. One of the most challenging aspects of most art forms. To say more with less. It is no secret that singing is a fundamental element in Chopin's musical language. Given the simplicity of the melody and the accompaniment, it is essential to consider the physical characteristics of the piano to produce a singing quality with the instrument. As we know, pressing a key on a piano initiates the sound that immediately starts fading, making it critical how we press the key and what movement follows that. I would like to put it this way. Mastery in piano playing revolves around crafting illusions. These illusions come to life with the impact we create while moving from one key to another. Let's begin with the intro. Here we have a choral texture consisting of 3 layers. The top voices of the upper layer must stand out to shape the melodic line, of course within the delicate pianissimo dynamic. The other voices of the top and middle layers will resonate gentler. Their function is to color the harmony. Meanwhile, the lower layer provides a stable foundation to support the melody. Now I'd like to address the wrist motions, arguably the most vital tool in producing a beautiful tone. Start the first motif by letting the wrist descend with the forearm's assistance. Keep your hand flexible and imagine gently pulling the keys towards you to minimize resistance and create a softer attack. Play the next chord employing a diving motion and conclude the motif by raising the wrist. This way we play 2 elements in one gesture, which results in a more melodic outcome. Let's start the subsequent motif similarly. 2 components, a single gesture. However, we sustain the upper voice with the finger to establish a melodic connection with the last chord this time. Finally, we conclude the sequence with a slight bouncing motion. As you play the last chord, keep your wrist relatively elevated to minimize weight for a softer sound. The way I like phrasing the first sequence is straightforward. I gradually reduce the dynamics. Continuing in the same musical direction, I keep decreasing the dynamics in the following sequence. The lower layer, played with the left hand, is neither as prominent as the upper line nor as soft as the other voices. Let's replicate the wrist motions the right hand uses, descending and pulling. Despite its tragic character, this introduction carries nobility, setting the stage for the heartbreaking melody that is about to appear. One of the most significant challenges in this music lies in maintaining consistency among the 4 eighth notes motifs of the left hand, which persist throughout most of the piece. How we play the accompaniment determines whether the melody takes the lead or becomes overshadowed by the left hand. Once more, the wrist emerges as our most vital tool for playing these motifs melodically, consistently, and beautifully. The idea behind the motion I will demonstrate is to avoid relying solely on the fingers, as this can lead to tenseness in the hand and negatively impact the quality of the sound. Also, considering the frequent occurrence of the wide intervals, the proper wrist motion can significantly smoothen the transition from one note to another. Now here's what to do. Firstly, ensure that your wrist maintains flexibility and that your forearm has complete control over its movement. Begin from a neutral position. Dive with the first note, reach the bottom as you move to the right with the next, and ascend with the other notes. While the shape may vary slightly depending on the motif, I typically trace semicircular motions with the wrist for each of them. I gently emphasize the bass notes while gradually softening the remainder in each motif, visualizing the bass note as the root from which the other 3 notes blossom. Later in the video I will explain how to use the sustain pedal, but I recommend avoiding it at this stage. This approach will challenge you to develop consistent and melodic playing from the outset, leading to better results. Now come the quarter notes that we need to sustain with the fingers. While prolonging might be enough to hear their presence, I like to gently accentuate them. This way, I allow the melody to echo in the left hand. In the next motif, I draw a full circle with my wrist to achieve a more melodic result. Finally, I conclude the first section with 2 subtle half-circle wrist motions from right to left. Chopin's piano compositions are often associated with the Italian vocal style bel canto and showcase his genius for creating melodies filled with beauty and profound emotion. However, it's the performer's job to construct an elegant accompaniment, as it serves as a canvas on which the melody can truly shine. Since this piece mostly remains in softer dynamics, you can begin with a simple task and focus on learning only the left hand softly. Later, when you integrate the right hand, you can easily adjust the volume to support the melody, increasing or decreasing as desired. Let's now shift our focus to the right hand and take a look at the opening phrase, spanning 8 measures. Given that the trills are one of the signature characters in this piece, I'd like to start by clarifying how I approach them. When playing Chopin, I refrain from playing the trills symmetrically or calculatedly, as I would with pieces from the classical period, for example. Instead, I pursue a more romantic approach, starting the trill slowly and accelerating as I progress towards its end. Or another one. As I'm about to demonstrate, I highly recommend practicing the trills carefully to prevent an interpretation that may sound random and uncertain. The first step is to practice the trills softly and slowly. The aim is to cultivate consistency by producing similar sounds with both keys. To achieve this, keep your fingers flatter for more flexibility and lift your wrist slightly to lighten the fingers' weight and enhance their freedom. When executing the trill, envision controlling your fingers with the bass knuckles. Once you have familiarized yourself with the sensation and can comfortably control your fingers, you can transition to a slightly faster tempo. Then you can increase the speed further and keep progressing. What's most crucial is maintaining lightness and flexibility, regardless of the pace. As the final step, begin the trill slowly and then gradually accelerate. Let's start crafting the first phrase with the right hand. But before we proceed, it's critical to understand a core principle. Essentially, I curve my finger for stability when playing in the key and flatten it for flexibility when playing out of the key. Mastery of these 2 fundamental motions, resistance and release, directly affects the sound quality. Back to the melody. I go in and out with the G sharp and play the trill in the neutral wrist position. I trace a half circle with my wrist, starting from the grace notes and extending to the following first beat. Then, staying in the neutral position, I softly play the C sharp. Next, I employ 2 in and out wrist motions in the following measure. One is solely for the C sharp on the first beat. Then I go in with the following C sharp and out with the remaining notes. I conclude the first half of the phrase with a subtle emphasis by bouncing the wrist. In measures 9 and 10, I execute 2 half-circular wrist motions, first from right to left and then from left to right. After emphasizing the G sharp by reaching the bottom of the key, I reset my wrist position to soften the D sharp. Following that, I reduce the resistance for a lighter emphasis, and then play softly the remaining notes in the neutral position. The final 2 bars are the most delicate. Starting with a slight in and out wrist motion with the grace notes, I maintain a higher wrist position to preserve lightness, concluding the phrase with minimal resistance and the softest touch possible. Before putting together the first phrase, let's outline the phrasing plan. I'll start by emphasizing the melody's entrance. Then, I will increase the speed and volume of the trill, which I'll begin lightly and slowly. Transitioning to the next bar, I'll emphasize the first beat and softly conclude the motif. The melody will then intensify over the following 2 measures. Maintaining generous dynamics, I'll lighten the end of the slur without a significant volume loss, as the little decrescendo is more about shaping the melody. Beginning the next bar with the same intensity, I'll soften the dynamics with the decrescendo. Lightly emphasizing the start of the subsequent bar, I'll further ease the melody. After an even lighter emphasis at the beginning of the following bar, I'll lighten the trill as much as possible and delicately conclude the first phrase. Let's now observe how the previously explained wrist movements facilitate this approach. Now, onto the second phrase. Its first half retains the harmonic identity of the first phrase, naturally resulting in some similarities in its musical design and execution. Nevertheless, the melody becomes more crowded here, and in my view, it possesses a more dramatic character. Following the upbeat, I employ the same wrist motions as in the first phrase, until reaching the quarter notes in the subsequent measure. Then, utilizing downward and upward wrist motions, I gather momentum to apply more weight when starting the next passage, where Chopin demands con forza, playing with force. Here we encounter another signature character of this piece, a scale with multiple note values. Firstly, it's important to note that emphasizing difference between these rhythms is not the primary goal. Chopin's grouping of these notes signals his intention to accelerate the passage gradually, with slower note values at the start progressing to faster ones. Ideally, to give a natural singing direction to the passage, I begin by extending the timing of the first group and progressively compress the tempo towards the end. However, executing this approach with both hands requires independence in controlling each hand simultaneously, a challenge we will address later in the video. After generating extra force for more sound at the beginning of the passage by pushing the forearm, let's gradually raise the wrist toward the end of the bar to diminish the intensity. I prefer articulating the first three groups with a somewhat non-legato touch, infusing energy into each key. Then, I conclude the passage by playing legato in the last three groups, and arriving at measure 16 with a wrist bounce. I start bar 17 with an in and out motion, dive with more weight to accentuate the next note, and then end the bar while resetting the wrist position. I accentuate the beginning of the following bar by diving with the wrist, but start trilling while moving it upward. To naturally build a crescendo, I trace a half circle with my wrist during the 16th notes, accentuating the E with the generated momentum. From here onwards, I play each note by filling the bottom of the key and adjusting the duration of each stay according to the note's values. Sustaining wrist flexibility with bouncing motions helps prevent an overly aggressive sound, even in the fortissimo dynamic. Here's the plan. Given the similarities between the first and the second phrases, it's natural to start with a similar phrasing here. However, considering the composer's dynamic choices in the second phrase, we must intensify the general expression. As before, I'll emphasize the first beat, begin the trill calmly but gradually increase its speed and volume, and then emphasize the subsequent first beat. Moving forward, I'll increase the dynamics with the crescendo, reaching the climax of the passage with a generous amount of sound. Without losing much volume, I'll shape the line by softening its end, then emphasize the next bar. Starting the second half of the phrase decisively, I'll accentuate the following note and the trill, then increase the dynamics further towards the E. Reaching the only appearance of the fortissimo in the entire piece, I will powerfully conclude the phrase. Utilizing the wrist motions explained earlier, let's play the second phrase with the right hand. Before we play the first part with both hands, let me outline these key points. Firstly, about the grace notes. In bar 5, I play the grace notes after playing the last 8 note in the left hand. Alternatively, you could synchronize them. A slower execution will make them sound more pronounced. At bar 11, I start the trill from the E to avoid repeating the D sharp. Also, I play the grace notes on the first beat and conclude the trill by the fourth. Alternatively, you could play the grace notes before the beat, start the trill from the D sharp, or extend the trill until the last 8th note. Bar 13 mirrors bar 5 quite closely. For consistency, I recommend sticking with the approach you chose earlier for the grace notes. Also, here's a little musical offer. To evoke a feeling of despair in the melody, consider introducing a brief pause before playing the G sharp in bar 14, like a moment of hesitation. This syncopation between the hands can stimulate the sensation of taking a step unwillingly. About the passage at measure 15, focus your practice on observing the various note values and achieving exact synchronization with the left hand, especially in the first stage. Also, please avoid the common habit of accentuating the first notes of the groups in the right hand, as this can be counterproductive. Once you have synchronized both hands with rhythmic precision, you can advance to the next stage, mastering the ability to independently control each hand to improve the musicality of the passage. Here's what to do. Start the right hand with more expansive timing and gradually accelerate towards the end. Meanwhile, maintain a stable tempo in the left hand. As a result, the melody may not perfectly synchronize with the accompaniment, yet allowing for flexibility in the right hand while providing rhythmic stability with the left hand gives the passage a more organic direction and captures the essence of singing with the piano. Regarding pedaling, Chopin's markings in bar 5 and 6 suggest a pedal change with each harmony. Still, given the modern pianos we use today, I have some suggestions you can adapt to your preferences. Firstly, I recommend changing the pedal immediately after the first beats to enhance the connection of the left hand's motifs without causing blurring. At bar 8, I prefer changing the pedal on the third beat, despite the same harmony. Doing so highlights the pause in the right hand, leading to a fresh start with the melody in the next measure. In bar 11, I change the pedal on the fourth beat, allowing the trill to resonate as a whole while avoiding the blur at the end of the bar due to the harmonic change. Alternatively, you can change the pedal on the third beat or decrease the resonance by gradually lifting your foot. At bar 12, I again change the pedal on the third beat, aiming to create a pause in the melody and infuse freshness into the start of the second phrase. Lastly, on the third beat of bar 20, I release the pedal, requiring the use of the finger legato technique. The benefit is that it enables a seamless transition from fortissimo to pianissimo within one measure, preparing for the middle section, which introduces an entirely different color palette. Now let's play the first part of the piece with both hands. Picture a dialogue where the first phrase leaves you with an unresolved question, and then the second phrase offers a resolute answer. In the middle part of the piece, Chopin calls for a severe dynamic contrast, transitioning from fortissimo to pianissimo. Also, given the harmonic change, he intends to set a completely different atmosphere in this portion of the piece. Let's delve into the first section of the middle part. The left hand offers no surprises. Chopin maintains the same texture as in the first part. We must keep the accompaniment softer than the melody, and as you can envision, achieving this balance is significantly more challenging in pianissimo. Therefore, dedicating time exclusively to practicing the left hand is essential. Ensure you employ the same wrist motions mentioned earlier and maintain consistent phrasing for each motif, regardless of the dynamic markings. Now, let's shift our focus to the right hand. Here we encountered 3 phrases, each spanning 4 bars. From a musical standpoint, each phrase begins by introducing an idea in the initial 2 bars, followed by a reaction in the subsequent 2 bars. Let's start with the first phrase. I aim to delicately shape the motifs by softly stressing their beginnings in the first 2 bars. I achieve this more by lingering on these notes than by accentuating them. Additionally, I apply subtle decrescendos for each motif, with a more pronounced one on the third motif. Given the pianissimo dynamic, wrist movements become critical for executing these nuances effectively. To emphasize the first notes, I dive with my wrist, and to lighten the motifs, I raise it. Following this graceful melody, a charming response emerges. Here we encounter two double note motifs where the first is slurred while the second isn't. For the first motif, let's emphasize the upper notes, prolong our stay on the keys as much as possible, and gently increase the dynamics. Moving to the second motif, let's maintain the presence of the upper notes, slightly shorten the duration of the stay in the keys, and soften the ending. For optimal execution, I employ different techniques for each motif. In the first one, I use the weights to emphasize the notes falling on the beats by reaching the bottom of the keys. In contrast, I rely on momentum for the second motif, delicately dipping my wrist for the shorter notes, while swiftly raising it on the beats to generate force. The following phrase recalls the previous one, yet this time it appears in F sharp minor and resolves in C sharp minor. Also, it presents notable differences in dynamics and articulation. Keeping sotto voce in mind, I start the first motif with non-legato articulation, pronouncing each tone individually. Then I emphasize the beginning of the next motif and develop the melody with the crescendo. The following bar is crafted almost identically to the previous phrase. I'll highlight the beginning of each motif and execute two decrescendos that harmonize with their directions. The response in the following two measures will be similar to the previous phrase. Remember the two wrist techniques I previously explained for emphasis and lightness, and linger in the keys for as long as possible for better connection. The third phrase begins assertively, but abruptly shies away entering its second bar. On the other hand, its answer, in a way, reverses this pattern. Though it doesn't return to forte, it begins softly in its third measure and concludes more decisively in its final bar. I start the trill with a downward wrist motion and ease its intensity by returning to the neutral position. Moving towards the third beat, I execute a half circle motion, and to softly conclude the bar, I keep my wrist at the top position. While maintaining my wrist at the upper position for lightness, I conclude the measure with a wrist bounce to accentuate the final D sharp gently. I'll delicately emphasize the first and third beats in the upcoming measure by diving my wrist. As for the remaining notes, I'll play them as I lift my wrist to maintain a light touch. Next, to conclude the phrase, I'll gently emphasize each beat with a wrist bounce and increase the dynamics. Not much. After all, we are transitioning from pianissimo to piano. Chopin dedicated this piece to his sister Ludwika, sending it from Vienna with a note: for my sister Ludwika, to practice before she takes on my second concerto. In both the first and second phrases of the middle part, he quotes a portion of the main theme from the concerto's third movement, and concludes these phrases with a portion of the second theme from the first movement. He also concludes the third phrase by repeating the initial motif of the concerto twice in a row. Following this, Chopin quotes another thematic material from the concerto's third movement, which he characterized as scherzando, providing insight into how to interpret the remaining middle section, possibly with a playful, mazurka-like dance character. To achieve this, I emphasize the second beat of the new motif in bar 32, followed by the first beat in bar 33, maintaining this pattern until the end of the middle section. Here is how to execute this plan effectively. In bar 32, I trace a half circle with my wrist to play the triplet more melodically. I end the triplet with the first finger and play the B sharp with the second to naturally separate them. In bar 33, I begin with the wrist bounce for accentuation, draw another half circle for the triplet, and lightly conclude the bar while the wrist is in the upper position. Although I don't emphasize the note following the triplet this time, I ensure their separation by shortening its last note. Bar 34 replicates the previous one, so I'll employ the same wrist motions and articulation. In bar 35, a new motif emerges, yet it bears a musical resemblance to bar 33. Here's my approach. I accentuate the quarter notes with wrist bounces, while playing the 8 notes lightly with my left hand. With the right hand, I execute half circle motions for each motif. However, to play the quarter notes lightly, I keep my wrist elevated, and to emphasize the dotted quarter notes, I swiftly raise the wrist at the end of the half circle motion. Chopin concludes the middle part with an adagio section, reminiscent of the final measures of his second concerto's second movement. The only difference is Chopin's choice of G-sharp major tonality, which is the enharmonic equivalent of A-flat major, as heard in the concerto. Let me share my pedaling suggestions. Engaging the right pedal on the first and third beats of measures 21 and 22, I gradually release it to prevent excessive blurring. This adjustment, especially considering the number of neighboring notes in the melody, enhances the overall clarity of your playing. In the following 2 bars, I employ legato pedaling while pressing the pedal halfway, a technique I encourage you to explore. Also, we can implement the left pedal to add a unique color that complements this section. In the subsequent phrase, I stick to the same sustained pedal technique, although I skip the left pedal this time. This choice is based on the less gentle and more melancholic nature of this phrase compared to the previous one. In the next 4 measures, I gradually release the pedal after each first and third beat, like earlier. This way, we can ensure clarity in presenting the unique melody of the third phrase, characterized by its colorful harmony, dynamics, and articulation. I employ the sustained pedal on every first beat for the rest of the middle section. I sustain it briefly for motifs starting with triplets, and longer for those starting with quarter notes. This type of pedal usage creates a drier texture, spotlighting the dance-like character and creating a distinctive feel. Lastly, I conclude the middle part by sustaining the entire adagio section with a single pedal. Before playing the entire middle part, here is the plan. We start with the softest phrase in the piece. Despite subtle dynamic changes, let's maintain the pianissimo throughout. Picture the phrase proposing an idea in its first half and responding in the latter. In the following phrase, we adapt to its harmonic nature and the indicated sotto voce dynamic. So a little more volume, but still whispering. Again, envision a musical dialogue of action and reaction. We start the third phrase in forte and abruptly transition to pianissimo. Then follow the melody's direction with a decrescendo and crescendo, continuing the dialogue of proposal and response. Begin the next section with the piano dynamic, or mezzo piano. Then gradually decrease the volume and tempo until reaching the adagio. Here, following Chopin's indication of morendo, allow the melody to fade gently. Let's play the entire middle part. Moving on to the final part, we encounter a variation of the first theme. Since the left hand maintains the same technique, let's shift our attention to the right hand. Starting the melody with my wrist in the upper position, I go in and out with the first beat and play the trill in the neutral position. I generate momentum with the grace notes by drawing a half circle, resulting in an organic emphasis on the G sharp. Then, remaining in the upper position, I delicately stress the following note. The last note in this measure leads into the following passage, a sequence we have encountered in bar 15. I start from the upper position, dive into the key on the first beat, and gradually ease the intensity by lifting my wrist. Then I conclude the next measure with a wrist bounce to increase the volume in response to the crescendo. Next, I guide my arm to descend from a slightly elevated position, ensuring a distinct tone as my wrist reaches the bottom. Then, returning to a neutral position, I play the subsequent note with a lighter touch. While maintaining the same wrist position for the trill, I execute a half circle motion with the grace notes, and lightly stress the third and fourth beats by bouncing the wrist. In the following passage, indicated as con forza, the dynamics escalate even more, culminating in the climax described by Chopin as appassionato. In contrast to the previous passages, prioritizing smoothness, I accentuate the beginning of each motif here with subtle wrist movements. This approach not only shapes the motifs and distinguishes the articulations comfortably, but also echoes the G-sharp dominant 7th chord, strengthening the tension as we reach the most dramatic point of this music. In the upcoming measures, the goal is to sustain intensity in sound and shape each motif for melodic outcome. I draw a half circle with my wrist from right to left during the first motif. I repeat the same motion with the next one, then lightly bounce the wrist with the following note. In the next bar, I reverse the direction of the half circle motion and conclude the motif in the top position for lightness. I maintain the wrist in a neutral position during the trill, gently increasing and decreasing its volume. Make sure to lift your hand between the motifs to allow the melody to breathe. There are no additional instructions for the left hand. A little suggestion about measure 53. After accentuating the E in the first motif, you can emphasize the D sharp in the second motif to amplify the sense of harmonic resolution. Let's put both hands together. We have reached the coda, where the notorious scale passages await us. Let's address the technical aspect first. I recommend playing each scale with flatter hands to maintain finger flexibility, which is crucial for speed and lightness. Lower your wrist position for more resistance when moving upwards, which helps execute the crescendo. Conversely, keep your wrist higher for less resistance when moving downwards, facilitating the decrescendo. Looking at bar 57, notice the combination of legato and non-legato articulations. Given the passage's speed, distinguishing these articulations might be tricky. Here's my suggested approach. Execute the legato with precise finger control, aiming to seamlessly blend each tone with the next one. As you transition to the non-legato articulation, slide your fingers downward to shorten these notes. Fortunately, we don't encounter the non-legato articulation in the following bar, as this passage is twice as fast as the previous one. Often it's played by overstretching the tempo. However, considering Chopin's indication of velocissimo, meaning as fast as possible, I suggest avoiding excessive compromise to the overall pace. While it's understandable if you can't quite match the exact speed, especially if you have chosen a faster tempo for the piece, strive to get as close as possible. Indeed, slowly practicing is vital for mastering this passage. However, instead of mechanically repeating endlessly, envision your desired musical outcome and invest time in slowly playing while focusing on the dynamics and articulation. Refine each note's sound with your fingers, preferably without using the pedal, to fully grasp the nuances of your playing. The slight accent at the passage's beginning in bar 58 suggests that Chopin intends to integrate it more prominently into the melody. I prefer to highlight this note distinctly, envisioning how it resolves in the next measure. I imagine the passage resembling a sudden, melancholic gust of wind, not forceful, but emerging unexpectedly. The music gradually softens in the following passages, marked as delicato and delicatissimo by Chopin. To maintain control over dynamics, I continue applying the previously used wrist motions. In the final passage, as described earlier, I execute the non-legato articulation by sliding my fingers backward. The left hand continues to stick to the principles we have discussed earlier. Yet, the quarter notes at bar 58 to 60 demand attention due to the significant decrease in dynamics. Thus, we must emphasize them consciously. In bars 61 and 62, the left hand perhaps plays its most crucial role, operating solo for the first and only time, slowing the pace before the resolution in the final two bars. Please dedicate your utmost focus to this section. Given the irregular number of notes in the right-hand passages between bars 57 and 60, the question arises, how should they be divided into 4 to blend both hands? There is no definitive answer, as it depends on the interpretation. However, I'll illustrate a method to help you achieve a natural, fluid, free, and authentic outcome. Let's begin by identifying which notes in the right hand align with those in the left hand in the first passage. To divide the legato and non-legato notes of the passage proportionally, I recommend grouping them as 5, 5, 4, 4. While this approach is temporary, it facilitates the first stage of coordinating both hands and enables comfortable practice. Please do not accentuate the notes that coincide with the left hand to avoid developing an unnecessary habit. Despite the constraints of a calculated approach, aim for a beautiful sound, paying close attention to the dynamics and articulation of the passage. Once you're comfortable, you can proceed to the next step. Here we form two groups of 9 plus 9 within the passage, aligning their start with the first and third notes of the left hand. Reducing the number of synchronized points between each hand will make your playing sound more organic. The final step provides even more freedom, but is also the most challenging, as the notes between both hands start together, but then move independently. To maintain flexibility and artistic expression, explore various possibilities. For instance, you could stretch the beginning of the passage while compressing its end. Or vice versa, compress the beginning while stretching the end. Or you could start the passage slower, gradually increase the speed, and then decelerate as you approach the end. Experiment and discover what resonates with you the most. You can also apply these 3 steps to the upcoming passage. First, group its notes as 9, 9, 9, 8 to coordinate both hands smoothly. Then group them as 18 plus 17, aligning their start with the first and third notes of the left hand. Finally, let's aim to begin and end with both hands simultaneously. Considering the number of notes, there is limited flexibility in adjusting the speed. However, playing the initial and final notes slightly slower can add authenticity to the passage. I suggest following the same 3 steps in the last 2 passages. In measure 59, group the notes as 3, 3, 3, 2, then 6 plus 5, and finally play freer by compressing and stretching. In measure 60, group the notes as 4, 3, 3, 3, then 7, 6, and just as before, compress and stretch. Before playing the entire coda, let me offer some suggestions for pedaling. In bar 57, consider reducing or entirely releasing the pedal when transitioning to the non-legato articulation to create a more distinct contrast. Starting from the last beat of bar 58, I gradually release the pedal to prevent excessive blurring within the passage. I repeat this approach in measure 59 and then again in measure 60 to maintain clarity while softening the dynamics, considering the fragile character of this section. I recommend avoiding the left pedal until measure 63, reserving it as a wildcard for a significant color change at the end. I introduce it in the last two bars to evoke a heavenly atmosphere in C-sharp major, and conclude the piece as softly as possible. In this coda, Chopin creates a somewhat hopeless loop by preserving the same harmonies and consistently resolving the melody at G-sharp, despite the tendency of each passage to go elsewhere. Even though accents are present, gradually reducing their intensity is crucial. With Sempre più piano, he hints at a departure, where each bar becomes more distant than the last, leading towards the light at the end of the tunnel. Let's play the final section with both hands. Regarding the edition I use, I favor the second version from the National Urtext edition by Jan Ekier for its detailed examination of multiple sources. A controversial point arises in bar 8 concerning the left hand. Many editions suggest both motifs start with a D sharp, which seems incorrect. Ekier clarifies this by noting, the conversion text of the first autograph and the copy of Ludwika leaves no doubt that the final autograph had here F sharp. It's essential to recognize that Chopin often revised his notation, so we should preserve a degree of interpretive freedom regarding dynamics, tempo, and expression. For instance, I find Alfred Cortot's tempo suggestions in his edition intriguing, especially for the middle part. Cortot proposes a metronome marking of 92 per beat from bar 21, transitioning to 160 per beat with an animato tempo marking from bar 33, reminiscent of the tempos in Chopin's second piano concerto. Speaking of tempo, the title Lento con gran espressione indicates Chopin's intention for a slow pace with grand expression. It's essentially all the information we need. My interpretation tends toward the slower end of the spectrum compared to many recordings, because in my experience, playing this music at a slower tempo allows for a more profound expression. Now that I've shared everything I wanted to tell in this video, it's time to say more with less. Here it comes. If you are interested in my fingerings, you can find them in the free sheet music available in the description. Please let me know what you would like to hear more from Chopin in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, give it a like to support the channel. Until next time.